So first off, again, welcome to the session. This is Plenary 1 at EMP-E 2020, the impacts of COVID-19 on the energy system. What are the consequences for future energy modeling? Before I move on, I have the obligation to tell everyone this session is being recorded, so please keep that in mind. And we will publish some minutes or a short report about this session afterwards. So this session came out of early discussions with some colleagues from the European Commission who were interested in a response to the COVID crisis from the energy modeling community. And this session is the first attempt to make such a response happen. As a central motivation here, we have really two things. The first one is to consider that while this COVID-19 crisis that we're all living through currently was in a lot of ways are fundamentally unpredictable in terms of where, when, and how it would come about, the fact remains that when you're thinking about energy models that are looking 50 to 100 years into the future, the likelihood that some sort of societal disruption happens becomes non-zero, and this likelihood increases the further that we look into the future, whether this comes from pestilence, as it does today, or some sort of supply side disruption, etc. And so what we're hoping to do here is moving forward to internalize the lesson of this crisis so that we can try to make future modeling exercises more robust and deliver, as we just heard from our colleagues from the European Commission, robust policy evidence for them. And the second thing here is that results from system models that were produced before the pandemic may need to be reassessed, as perhaps the underlying structures of energy supply and demand, especially when we're considering consumer preferences. Now, obviously, people are less likely to want to stand in large groups on a subway, et cetera. And so these structures may be changed as we move into the post-pandemic era. And so those are the two motivations for what we're trying to accomplish here in Plenary 1 with this first hour of the EMP-E. So due to the large number of participants today, we want to interact with the participants as much as possible. So we have set up a Slido tool website for this interaction. So I'd invite you at this point to please open a web browser, type in slido.com. Once that web page opens, you'll see a field that you can fill in, and you can enter the code EMP-E COVID, EMP-E COVID, and then you will be in the Slido site for our session today. This site has two panels. The first one is a question and answer panel where you can put in questions for our speakers, and we'll have a short panel discussion with them for about 10 to 15 minutes after the presentations. And the second side of that is an ideas panel. And this is, as I mentioned before, we're gonna have put a report together in some minutes of this meeting. So if you have ideas, comments, we don't have the capability to everyone to say that verbally, but you can type your ideas or comments into that Slido site, and we can look at them later, and those will be sure to get to us. So today we find the EMP-E conference in a new format, a virtual format. We've already had very slight technical problems. I know I use GoToWebinar almost every day, and today, for some reason, when I opened it up, it gave me an error I had never seen before. And so we're all working through these things. We're really happy to have such great participation here. And we think that moving forward, dealing with this pandemic as a community could make us stronger in a lot of ways. It can give us different tools to work with so that maybe moving forward, we don't have to fly quite as often to meet together. We've really tried, as Sandrine mentioned before, to integrate new tools into this session and into this conference. So B2 Match and spatial chat tools are available. And so the more that all of you out there participate with these tools, the more this will seem like a real conference and the more we can really have great success that we're all used to at the EMP-E conferences. So without further ado, let's move on to the session for today. This session is organized basically in two parts with two presentations each. The first part is a bird's eye view, which considers how COVID-19 has impacted the energy system so far and how we start to conceptualize this impact and future shocks into energy system models. The second part will highlight two applications. These are brand new work that will be revealed for the first time here at EMP-E 2020. And these efforts attempt to integrate new structures of energy demand and supply into existing energy system models. So Saminder, perhaps we can go to Professor Claudia Kempfert as our first speaker and allow her to share her screen. Thank you, Professor Kempfert, for joining us this morning. She is a professor of energy economics and sustainability at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. She heads the Energy, Transportation, and Environment Department at the German Institute for Economic Research, DIW Berlin. Thank you, Professor Kempfert. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me here this morning, and thanks also for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID on the energy system and the economy. This is what I tended to ask to do so. I'm pleased to do so, and I would love to show some slides, and I hope you can see my slides. I'm not sure whether you can do that.
We can see the first one, yes.
You can see the first one. Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's exactly I wanted to talk briefly about is to say some words about the macroeconomic effects on also on the energy system we see so far. So what we the system is probably a little bit slow. I tried to show the next slide. I hope you can see that as well. Hopefully
Yes.
it's the case. So what we face actually is severe crisis. No doubt about that. What we are facing is actually the next and the overnext crisis. This is both the economic crisis and the climate change crisis. So we have to face right now that we have to deal with several crises, starting from COVID and the economy and the energy system and also climate change. So if we put on the restart button, we need to take into account that we have to solve also that the climate change crisis is not getting more severe, but that we can reduce emissions as heavy as possible. And so what we see briefly is in a few months when the shutdown has been started in March, that the environment and the climate temporarily respire. We saw some blue skies over Venice. We saw some blue skies in China. But what also happened, and that's even more severe, is that the economy also collapsed. It has been in a free fall. If we see here, not quite sure whether you see my mouse actually. Just a second. Try to put that on.
We do. We see your
We
mouse.
see it.
Oh, you see. Oh, wonderful. That's great. Thank you. So you see right now, I mean, here right now is a free fall of the global annual change and the GDP. And here you see the massive collapse we see already here. So, and that's quite severe. And we have to take that into account if we are talking about now about future impacts and stimulus packages, which I will try to talk also briefly in a minute about this. So try to put the next slide. So what we really need is a healthy environment, a healthy climate, a healthy economy, and a healthy society. So what actually happened when the COVID crisis started, that we had a little bit of a healthy environment, but at the expense of the economy. So we need to solve all the different crises in parallel in order to get also a healthy economy, but also a healthy environment and climate in total. But a healthy society, of course, is a short-term issue that we all get the impacts of the COVID crisis and to reduce these kind of impacts and look for short-term measures as well. So the effects of the COVID on the global economy and in energy, I'll just briefly give you some impacts. We have to distinguish between short-term effects, medium-term effects, and long-term effects. We're looking at the global economy. There has been a global shutdown, and the globalization is reduced. The trade restrictions have been diminished, and also that we might see some long-term effects of this as well, especially on infrastructure or aviation and some impacts on specific sectors. The economic growth, I just have shown you that there has been a global recession and also recession in some countries. The different, I will show you in a minute, the differences between the regions. And also there might be some long-term effects of this as well. And the emissions went down, as I just said, it's open how we can solve this in the midterm and long term, whether we are able to really implement climate and sustainability policies in order to get the emissions, keep the emissions at a low level. And the energy sector, I will show you in a minute, has been a strong recession. So the energy demand has been reduced. It's already on the medium term. What we see already is that it's been increase again, and we will have to face what kind of long-term effects we see. And on oil and gas, there has been a massive reduction on oil and gas prices as well. So. And also a reduction of demand, of course, because of reduction of aviation and the transport sector on the short term with a shutdown. And now the open question is, what is the outcome out of this crisis if we face the next crisis, which is a climate crisis, in order to stabilize the emissions at a lower level, and also the renewable impact. So there has been also a reduced investment due to the recession. However, there's also a competition by reduced fuel prices and lower cost of renewables as well. So there is a mixed picture I will show you in a minute. And of course, the coal industry is quite interesting to see this, especially from the German perspective. But I will keep this out. So the oil price development, we saw there has been a strong decline of the oil price. I mean, all the time this fever curve before, but then there's a strong decline of the oil price on the global markets when China started the quarantine and the global recession started. And we still see this movement and see there's a strong impact on oil companies globally. A lot of companies also in Europe, like Shell, or in the US, like Exxon, are reducing employment drastically. So you see there is some kind of sellout of oil, of fossil fuel, which we are facing right now. Just a brief summary on the global effects on the energy system. We can look that up also on the IEA website. So there is a global energy demand decrease by 3.8% in the first quarter, which we see here, as I just said, is oil, but it's also coal and gas, a little bit of nuclear. Interestingly, renewables have been increased a little bit. That's one part of the story, that we will see a decline of fossil fuel, but an increase of renewables, because renewables stabilize the energy system. It's increasing resilience. It has low costs and low emissions, so it's quite the answer to many of the difficulties we have right now. And this is the reason why we will even see a further increase of renewables in the next future. In the European Union, there has been an energy demand decrease by 5%. As I just said, renewables is some kind of a little winner out of this and will be the winner out of the crisis. And the growth rates declined, but nevertheless, there is still an increase because also of costs, comparative costs, and also because of the stimulus packages, recovery packages we see worldwide. There is an increase of renewables of this as well, and the Green New Deal, especially in Europe, for example. So there is redirections from fossil fuels towards more renewables, also because of these packages. Here we see again what I just mentioned. Interestingly, it's always a steep decline. I just have wanted to show you these slides because of this fever curve and then the steep decline, in order to see how severe the global primary energy demand and how severe the corona crisis is. The same with the emissions. However, there is a time lag of global CO2 emissions. Here you see a decline, nevertheless, with increasing economic stimulus packages and increasing recovery of the economy, there will be an increase of emissions again. And road transport and aviation is one reason, because while the one reason of this recession and why we see the decreasing emissions as well. China always with the early start, because the crisis has started. The other regions are following and are still a little bit of recovering right now. And here the same, China. It's a number of flights, which we see there's a steep decrease of flights, and the others are following in a certain time lag. The electricity demand from the regional perspective, you see as well. So China quite stable, increasing again because they were the first coming out of the crisis. The others a little bit of delay of the lockdown, and also the electricity demand, which is decreasing as well, impacting the system in total. And here again, this interesting result that renewables are quite stable and a little bit increasing, and will increase because of the Green Deal in Europe as well, but the others, fossil fuel, are declining, especially coal. Coal is declining, renewables are increasing, and nuclear is declining. Renewables are a little bit increasing. Here's the same picture. Coal is going down, renewables are going up, and that's quite interesting, that coal is losing, renewables are winning. You will talk about this great conference about modeling, which is extremely interesting. And my colleagues, Paul Yu, Carlo, and all the others will join you this afternoon with the Genesis model, where we did results, or show you also results for the European market, especially what I just said. Coal is declining, renewables are increasing. We did scenarios on a 100% renewable energy world, extremely relevant right now because of COVID, because of emission reduction, because of climate crisis, and to increase the resilience of the energy system, but also of the economy in all European countries. And for this, I would like to close with just saying that we need to change in several ways. So we see already some patterns which would be desirable to stabilize, especially to increase the share of renewables, to go for a renewable energy world, and less fossil fuels, more renewables, especially in the mobility sector, and use some kind of a restart of this kind of COVID crisis, for stimulus and recovery packages, to go for a green world in a broader sense, with a sustainable mobility, with renewable energy, and with all the rest of the economy, which is decarbonized. And we could use this this crisis, the new start, I would say, not the crisis, the new start from the crisis, as a chance, with the 4Ds towards decarbonization, more digitalization, as we use for the conference here today, decentralization with renewable energy, and democratization, which is more participation also from the energy system point of view, and solve three crises with one: the economic crisis, the energy crisis, and the climate crisis, by reducing emissions. With this, I would thank you very much and wish you all a wonderful conference, and thanks again for having me this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kempfert. That was a fantastic synthesis of a very complicated interplay between climate, energy, and economy that is playing out every day as this pandemic progresses. So we'll move on to our next speaker. Saminder, if you could please bring up the slides for Professor Reinhard Haas. And while that is going on, I will remind you that we have, if you have questions or ideas for our speakers, please go to slido.com, enter the code EMP-E COVID with no punctuation, and you can leave your questions and ideas there that we can discuss later in a panel format. So now on to our second presenter, Professor Reinhard Haas. He is a university professor of energy economics at Vienna University of Technology in Austria. He teaches energy economics, regulation, and competition in energy markets and energy modeling. Today, he's going to talk to us about energy system modeling under shocks and disruption. Mr. Haas, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Hello, Claudia. Nice to see you. I think we have quite a nice panel. Actually, Chad, we have slightly changed the title some weeks ago, so I will focus mainly on the modeling of energy systems under disruptions, under structural breaks, and I will focus on the energy economic point of view. So I will first start with short motivation, present basics of energy modeling, explain the impact of price and income, shortly discuss what really is a disruption, dynamics and irreversibilities are of high relevance, and finally I will go to the, I don't know, but policy strategies and conclusions. So we have three major motivations today: heading towards sustainable energy systems, identifying the major impact parameters in the energy system, what are major drivers, what are slowers, and how can we finally derive efficient and effective energy policies. Basics of energy modeling are shown in this next slide. Here you have on the left side, on the top, we have energy supply model. We have mainly associations with linear programming. On the supply side, we try to optimize mainly to minimize the costs, and energy supply depends on the costs of energy provision, on the market price, and also on energy demand. And usually such a system starts with the modeling of the demand side. That is to say, we have econometric models to analyze past energy demand, usually as a function of the price, income, and the heating degree days as most important parameters. And then we bring together these systems components in a supply and demand intersection. There is delay in the response of the program. So here you can see this is a typical demand, typical supply curve in such a system, and it is connected with the demand side, leading finally to the energy price of the system. This is finally called the market model. Next, we move to the major impact of price and income. I would say from my analysis, most of the time energy prices and income describe quite well energy consumption. And there's also the link between energy and GDP, and we can also see from the past there are not too many breaks. That is to say, if we had crisis, economic crisis, the energy demand was stagnating or even going slightly back. In other times it was progressing. So the basic equation is shown here, and we usually estimate finally in a logarithmic form, and this equation also already includes a so-called lag to take into account responses by the customer to price changes. In the next slide, we move a little bit further, starting from this basic equation I have shown before. We can go towards co-integration. We can use autoregressive distributed lag models, and we can also include the error correction model in the autoregressive distributed lag. And these error correction models finally allow us to capture short and long-term responses separately. Here I show you an example of a country and its development of energy consumption over time since 1955. This is Austria, but it could be any country, let's say at least in Europe or in the OECD. We have always in these countries similar patterns. So with the next slide, I refer to this Austrian slide and discuss what is really a disruption. This blue curve now shows the aggregated primary energy demand, and if we look at the period 1960 to 1973, these were the first models. The first models were solely based on income and a virtually pure linear growth. But these first models disappeared, and it makes sense that they disappeared because we finally soon recognized that changes per year also depend on prices. That is to say, we can have a stylized form of this energy demand, and here we have the first, let's say, disruption. It was clearly first oil crisis 1973, followed by the Iran-Iraq war with the highest, let's say, change down in energy consumption about 1979, 1980, and afterwards we had the next change in the system with a significant decrease of the oil price. In the years after 2007, we can see that oil prices have increased, and finally here in the year 2009 we have the economic crisis, where for 1 year the energy consumption went down, but 1 year later it already recovered again. And now the next question is the COVID crisis. And from my point of view, it is also of interest whether it would be possible to describe the COVID crisis solely by the changes in income, or whether we will use, as shown here in this extended equation, dummy variables for specific years to explain these structural breaks. In addition, I think it is very important to consider several dynamic developments. For example, income elasticity over time could become smaller and smaller. There are already investigations which has proven this. Then we have the issue of irreversible efficiency improvements, for example, with respect to buildings, but also with respect to cars. We have the well-known rebound effect following energy efficiency measures. We have already mentioned that the lags may play a very important role. And finally, we have to consider that changes from sector to sector are different. That is to say, changes in industry are much stronger related to changes in the GDP, while, for example, in the household sector, we couldn't see in 2009 really significant backlashes regarding energy. So finally, the question is, which policies? I move back to the energy market model I have introduced in the beginning, and we can implement policies on the demand side. We can set standards for appliances, for cars. We can influence the price by means of taxes or setting tariffs. And on the supply side, we can provide, for example, subsidies for renewables. We can implement standards for power plants and refineries. This leads finally to my major conclusions. What is, from my point of view, still an open question is what are real disruptions? I would say that most so-called disruptions can be explained by the changes in GDP. Important are considerations of dynamics, for example, the changes in the elasticities. An open issue could also be the model service demand instead of energy demand. That is to say, you model kilometer driven in transport and you do not just model the number of gasoline used. And what I always tell my students when teaching on energy modeling, first, please try to keep the model as simple as possible and just as complicated as necessary. And in any case, how many papers may have been written already on energy modeling? Good ideas are always the basic ingredients for improving this area of research. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Haas. Given us a lot to think about in terms of disruptions in the energy models moving forward, and I already see some great questions coming out from the participants. We're a couple minutes behind schedule, so we will move on to Dr. Clemens Alesur and our next speaker. If we can bring up Dr. Alesur's presentation, please. Fantastic. Dr. Clemens Alesur is the director of the Finance and Energy Markets Research Group at Électricité de France Research and Development. She is an expert on energy market risk management for operational divisions, and her research interests include the modeling of power prices, pricing, and finance applied to the electricity system. Today, she will talk to us about modeling the French power system during COVID-19. Clemens, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jed, for this nice introduction. And today, so the purpose of my talk is really to illustrate some effects the lockdown period has on the French power systems. There have been many effects, so I'm not able to illustrate all of them, but some of them. So the first thing which happened, of course, during the lockdown, and Claudia in her talk already talked about that, is the diminution of demand which occurred during the lockdown. And here it is illustrated on this graphic where you see in black, the black line illustrated the French power demand before the lockdown. Here you have, I don't know if you can see my mouse, I don't think so, but the dash line illustrates the beginning of the lockdown, and the second dash line is the end of the lockdown. And what is obvious, of course, is when the lockdown starts, the demand decrease, and it is also reinforced because the weather conditions were pretty good, so people require less heating and lighting, and those two conditions means that we had less need for the power demand was lower. As a result, the production that was needed to cover this power demand were required nearly no thermal power production. So you see here on this graphic the different production technology which has been required. So you see on the bottom the wind production, then you have the PV production, the nuclear in yellow, and then the hydro in blue, and the others are the thermal power plant, which gas and coal. And what is obvious is that those thermal plants has not been used a lot during the lockdown period, and therefore also because the meteo conditions were good for PV and wind production, we had an instantaneous coverage rate between 5 and 35% of the production made by this type of renewable, which is quite high for France. And this phenomenon has been also observed, of course, in other countries in Europe. As a result, also, because we have nearly no thermal production and only very low emissive production to cover the power demand, the average rate of emission were about 15 grams CO2 per megawatt hour during April. Nevertheless, during the crisis, the French power system has been able to export a lot to its neighbor, and you can see that on the graphic with the gray line on the bottom of the graphic. So that's the main consequences on the production. So it means that our the production use were nearly low carbon, and we rely a lot on renewables, including hydro and also nuclear. So maybe if we can go now to my second slide. Thank you. I'm going to illustrate now what happens on the power exchange, especially spot markets. Claudia already told us that the commodity price were very low because of the global world situation, and in Europe it was also reinforced because we have abundant supply from LNG from the US, and also because the wind, sorry, not the wind, the meteo condition, the winter has been very mild, so the storage, the gas storage were nearly full. Something we can stress also is the fact that in the merit order, because of these different prices for commodity, gas came first before coal. And also because the CO2 emission prices were still in the same type of level than before the crisis, so quite high, around 20 euros per ton. So because of all of this, the drop of demand, the good wind and PV production, and also these low commodity prices, then the short-term power prices market where has a very low prices, often lower than 20 euros per megawatt hour, and this is illustrated on the figures you can see on the bottom of my slide, where you see the spot power prices for France. And you have this lockdown period, especially where the price were quite low. Very interestingly, you have in red the episodes where the price became even so low that they even become negative. This might be feel strange for people to have negative prices, because a negative price means that people who are consuming are actually being paid for consuming. But there is a lot of economical rationality for having those negative spot price on the power system. First of it being the dynamic constraints of thermal power plants. Sometimes it's rational to stay on for several hours, because if you turn off your power plants, then you will be off for several hours and you will miss some future opportunities. So you prefer to stay on even during negative prices, so you pay for producing, but you will recover your revenue in the next hours after, where you can also benefit from better condition. This is also driven by some remuneration mechanism, especially linked to renewable, like feed-in tariff or feed-in premium, where a feed-in tariff, for example, is a tariff you will get whenever you produce. So there is no incentive for you to stop your production when the spot price is negative. Another thing, so we can see also that the crisis revealed a real tension on the downward flexibility margin. Indeed, the number of power plants which were on during this lockdown were lower than usual, and it was harder to get downward flexibility on this kind of system. Another important, interesting fact is the fact that the volatility of the spread between intraday and spot prices increased during this period, and this is certainly because the drop of demand was maybe not very easy to forecast for some players. Even if at the global scale of France, the forecasting errors of the demand remain quite in the range as usual, we can expect that from some players, the forecasting of their consumption of the consumption of their portfolio was really hard to forecast, and they have to balance their portfolio between the spot and the intraday when they get better value. And that's a thing also, is that the forecasting model for power consumption has been challenged a lot during the crisis. Can you go please to the third slide? Thank you. Because now what I want to tell you, I said that we had an issue or a challenge on downward also flexibility margin on the power system during the crisis. And concerning to France, this flexibility has been ensured a lot by the nuclear fleet, as this was assessed by the French TSO RTE. And you can see on the figure on the slide the number of active units in green at the different time of the period, and you see in orange, the straight line orange, the effective power from this nuclear units which were on. And maybe it's not very clear, but you have this orange dash line which represents what could these power plants which were on could have produced at the maximum. And you see that the nuclear fleet managed to really follow the drop of the weekend, and sometimes having a diminution of nearly 15 gigawatt during this special period when the nuclear managed to follow the variation of renewable and both of the demand. So thank you. Can you go to my conclusion, please? The last slide. Thank you so much. So here on this slide, I try to give you some insight of what were the short-term effects implied by the COVID crisis, which associated a very low demand because of the lockdown regulation, but also because the weather conditions were pretty good. So for France, we had a very nearly decarbonized power production during that period, with the nuclear which managed to do most of the required flexibility. As a consequence of all that, spot market prices were very low, and we had lots of negative prices. And I didn't say, but it was also an effect we can observe on the other European country. For example, in some countries where they never had negative prices, like Sweden and Finland, the COVID crisis has been the period where they encountered the first episode of negative prices. Of course, other short-term effects has been also recorded by, especially on the grid operation, and I had no time to cover all those topics, but it was also a fact that the grid has to answer a lot to this short-term aspect. And to finish with this presentation, I just want to say that the short-term effects also communicated to the midterm horizon, as Claudio stated. Indeed, for the power systems, we had two antagonist effects. The demand is bound to stay below its pre-crisis anticipated level for several months or years, maybe. And at the same time, the maintenance and the new capacity programs were delayed because of this lockdown period. And this is going to impact the production capacity now for the next winter, but also for the next coming years. So this crisis is going to affect the power system for several months now. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Dr. Alessur. That was a really fantastic view into the nuts and bolts of running a power system under the disruption of COVID. Also really interesting to hear that nuclear was the flexibility tool that was used during that period. So we'll move on to our next and final speaker. If we can stay on time, we'll have about 5 minutes for questions at the end. Our next speaker is Professor Manfred Hafner. He's a professor in international energy studies, teaching at Johns Hopkins University, the Po-Paris School of International Affairs, the Skolkolov Moscow School of Management, and he is the manager of the Future Energy Research Program at FEAM in Italy. Professor Manfred Hafner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you to the organizers for having invited me to present our recent modeling exercise on the impact of COVID-19 on the energy system and environment in Italy. Now, those of you who do not know us, FEAM is a research center on sustainable development based in Milan, Italy, and I run the Future Energy Research Program. Now, being FEAM the largest research foundation in Italy, And so during this terrible COVID sanitary crisis in spring this year, in particular in Lombardy, where FEAM is located, we thought we should give our contribution to the country somehow. And we thought, how could we do that in the best possible way? And we thought, given our expertise on energy research, energy scenario research, and our vocation to provide policy advice to decision makers, we thought we should launch a project on the impact of COVID-19 to energy systems and to the environment in Italy for the next 5 to 10 years, so midterm. We have done this in cooperation with the Energie Institute of the University of Johannes Kepler in Linz, Austria, and with IRES, which is a socioeconomic research institution based in Torino, Italy. Now, what have we done? So we have tried to model and try to understand, compared to a baseline scenario, what the new world would look like and what the difference would be between the post-COVID energy and emission world compared to the pre-COVID baseline scenarios. So we thought, what are the main drivers of the COVID-19 onto these energy systems and the emissions? And we came up with three main drivers. One, obviously, is the GDP evolution. COVID, sanitary crisis, economic crisis, GDP goes down, direct link to energy systems and environment. But we also thought there's a second one, which is related to the green investments. And these green investments, they could move either up or down. They could move down because there is less money in this huge crisis. The money is emptied with urgency measures, and eventually the decarbonization agenda gets a little bit forgotten. And so potentially the idea was it could reduce the needed investment for decarbonization, the green investments. On the other side, there are stimulus, there are green funds, special green funds, which should increase these investments for decarbonization. As we will see in the presentation, as time went by, we realized we approached the issue. I mean, Europe approached the issue in a positive way, in the sense that there's a huge recovery fund which has a very strong conditionality on green investments. We will see that later on. And then, last but not least, and I think very importantly and very original, today we think we may one of the only positive experiences of this dramatic COVID event is that we may realize that we can change our behavior for the better, and it doesn't cost us so much. And I will come back to that, but the idea is using digital technologies and traveling less. And so we wanted to analyze and to model the impact of these changes in behavior, which we have been forced to do during the lockdown, and for which most of us, not all of us, but most of us have realized that the benefits of it, of not having to go to the office every day, to be able to do smart working and working from home, to not having to travel all the time around the globe, and so on. I remember, and I'm sure many of us remember, having had to travel in one day from one European city to another European city on the other side of Europe, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, going to the airport, taking an airplane, arriving in another city, taking a taxi, going to the city center, maybe having a lunch plus a 2-hour meeting, and then everything back again, coming maybe with some delays in air traffic, coming back home at 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening and not having seen at all our children, for instance. So having been very tired in the evening for a 2-hour effective meeting. So new technologies, and this now is a perfect example, allow us to change our behavior for the better in a more sustainable way. So we have analyzed this, and I will present it very shortly. We have then integrated that in an energy system model where we have looked at the different energy sectors, power, industry, buildings, and transport, and we have looked at some important parameters like energy intensity, energy efficiency, the electricity mix, the technology mix, and so on, in order to give some scenarios and outcomes on final and primary energy consumption per type, per sector, and the related emissions, in order to then try to see what needs to be done to move from a less sustainable to a more sustainable pathway. This was of the 3 components: GDP, green investments, and the user behavior. Before doing that, we had to, the future by definition is uncertain. So we didn't know, and we still don't know, how long we have to deal with this virus, and how long this virus is disrupting our lives. So we have defined 3 different scenarios, and these scenarios, they have been defined by the length in time of the virus being disruptive for us. In other words, for the length of time for the virus being in charge of us and not us being in charge of the virus. Or to say differently, up to the moment when we have a vaccine effective for a majority of the people, and or an effective treatment that makes the virus ineffective. So we had big discussions. They were the most optimistic. They thought in 1 year everything is over, which would mean January or beginning of 2021. There were the more pessimistic. They thought it could potentially never happen, or let's say in 5 years' time. And then we agreed on a compromise, the medium scenario in around 2 years. So the idea is that in this medium scenario, starting from January or beginning of 2022, we go back to a kind of a normal life. So we have the 3 scenarios, keep them in mind. 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years disruption, whereas 1 year is already partly gone. Now, the first point, the economics, remember? GDP. Obviously, this COVID experience has shown a big impact on the economy. And according to the 3 scenarios, the best, 1 year, medium, 2 years, worst, 5 years, we have a different pattern of GDP evolution. This doesn't show the percentage change of GDP, but the real GDP in billion of euros. So you can see that if you have a very short disruption of 1 year, we would have a V kind of recession. In the medium term, an L kind of recession, and in the worst case, a W, or you may say a very low L kind of recession, with in total minus 22% GDP in 2030 compared to the baseline in black, and the yellow one, the medium one, would be about a minus 12% reduction. Now, what we have done, we have taken the information from Bank of Italy and other international organizations, and we have included there company closures for Italy, the fiscal and economic stimulus, and considerations on deficit and GDP, since it is already very high, and this limits the macroeconomic maneuver. On this slide, we can see that contrary to initial expectations, which some of us could have had, thanks to policies of the European Union, we may even foster and accelerate the energy transition and not break it down. And this is due to the Recovery Fund, which provides an important macroeconomic stimulus for all of Europe, in particular also for Italy, with some conditionalities attached related to the European Green Deal. And this very recently has been fostered, strengthened, going from 40% of emission reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 to 55% emission reduction by 2030 to 1990. So I'm waiting for the next slide to come up. Now the modeling on transportation. We have here combined different methodologies. On the shorter run, we have used an econometric assessment where we have linked the COVID-19 severity measured by the number of patients in ICUs with the mobility behavior of Italian citizens as measured through Google mobility data. And on the other side, for the more long term, we have had a survey by mobility and social science experts trying to give us their input to predict the pandemic. And then we have merged the two, and we arrived to some quite interesting results. Waiting for the slide to move forward. Okay. On this slide, we can see this is just an example on the users' behavior for passenger transport divided by public transport and private cars or private transport. Quite interesting to see, and quite logical if you think it through, that overall the people will tend to shift from public transportation to private transportation, and that they will continue doing so even when the virus story is over, because for different reasons. And the longer this the virus controlling us period, the longer it is, the more this is pronounced. And so in total, we can see that this shape, which you can see on these graphs, public transportation will reduce, but private car transportation tends to increase. Now I would like to go to my next slide. My next slide, yes, very briefly. What have we done from a modeling perspective after having started with GDP input, economic stimulus input, green investments input, behavior input in the transportation sector? We have entered this into a input-output model, which did different things, but the most important thing it is, it cut GDP down into sectoral and subsectoral GDP, all of which is needed in our energy system model, where we use both the overall GDP, the sectoral GDP, the subsectoral GDP, the green investments, the behavioral changes of transportation in order to arrive to our conclusions. And the next slide should give the preliminary results of our analysis. And here we can see let's look at the main graph on the left-hand side. The blue line is the baseline, the historical baseline, and the expected future baseline pre-COVID, without any COVID happening. And then we have the three scenarios with COVID: best, medium, and worst. Now, it is interesting to notice that this baseline scenario already had very strongly declining emissions from the energy system. The problem is so often, unfortunately, the only time when we do have a reduction in emissions, it's not because we do things rightly, but because of the wrong reason, because of economic crisis. And so this, again, here, since 2005 and 2009, 2014, this was to a very large extent due to economic crisis Italy had to go through over the last decade, but also due to its efforts on energy efficiency, on fostering decarbonization of the power system and some electrification of final energy consumption. Now, we can see on the, when we take into account the COVID scenarios, we can see there is a decline of emissions. Again, mainly for the wrong reasons, GDP reduction. And we can see in the worst case, it will end up at -10%, while GDP reduces, remember, -22%. So what are the drivers of this reduction by subsector, by final energy sector? Well, first of all, as we can very easily imagine and understand, there is no significant impact on the residential commercial sector, very little. Building sector, very little impact. On the other side, there's a huge impact, a very important impact in the industry sector. The industry sector is mainly driven, energy consumption industry sector is mainly driven by GDP. GDP goes down, so energy consumption industry sector goes down. Obviously, it also depends on the energy mix. And thirdly, transportation sector. Transportation sector, you can see here, it goes down a little bit less than the industry sector. Remember the slides we saw before of passenger transportation? It follows the same pattern, but it's slightly different. It's more negative. And there's a stronger reduction here due to the fact that in total transportation, we have about 2/3 of total transportation, which is due to passenger transportation, and therefore energy transportation, 1/3 out of freight transportation, and freight transportation is driven by GDP. And this declining rate, which may accelerate, is due to better efficiency of engines, but also due to a shift, technology shift to more electromobility and so on. Now I come to my very last slide. I know we are running over time, but I was given the floor late. The conclusions. So the work is not yet finished. We are still working on our project, but I think we are advanced enough to give some thoughts related to policy advice. And I would like to stress 3 points, which we think are very important. One, we need to make sure that the green investments will really support the expected results. In other words, that the money from the recovery fund really goes into green investment to a large extent, and it does not disappear somewhere else. Because we want to use this, and this has been designed, this recovery fund, and has been designed to help the the European Green Deal and to make Europe more sustainable. Second point, innovative technologies and digital solutions are needed to support a recovery of future GDP in European countries. In other words, we should take the opportunity of this crisis, of this economic crisis, to make the shift, to go away from technologies of the past to new technologies, to more sustainable technologies, and which in part are, of course, innovative, but also digital. And in the recovery fund, there is also a focus on that, of course. Third, remember when we saw, as far as passenger transportation was related, we saw an increase in private cars and a reduction in public transportation. Now, this is totally unsustainable. This doesn't, I mean, we understand why it happens, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. So it needs to be, it's not good for sustainability. And it also creates congestions. Our cities are already very highly congested. And so we think we need to have accompanying policy measures in the cities and elsewhere to promote and to support active transportation modes in urban environment. And in particular, for instance, we could imagine to have congestion charges which collect money, which is invested in bicycle lanes, in bike sharing, and in other active transportation means, which has a lot of advantages. It reduces congestion, it reduces emissions, and it allows us to do exercises. We don't need to pay money to go to the gym. And my final point, and then I'm over. My final point is we are doing this exercise for Italy, but we are very willing, we are very happy, we are very open to do this for any other European country and for the Europe as a whole. So this whole exercise is very easily replicable to other environments, to other countries. I thank you very much. I give the floor back to Jed.
Thank you, Professor Hoffner. That obviously a lot going on there, linking 3 to 4 different models it looked like, but really interesting work moving forward. So we're already a bit over time. I would ask all of the presenters, the panelists, to turn on their cameras. And we'll just to have a very short panel. We got some great questions and we can integrate these into the post-session wrap-up and this report that will come out of this. But I think there's one question that I can ask each of you that really gets at the heart of this conference itself. So I would ask each of you to try to answer this in 60 seconds or less. And perhaps we can go in the order we presented. So Professor Kempfert, you would be first. The question is, how can the COVID crisis and recovery plan accelerate the Green Deal? What are the pros and cons for the Green Deal?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think, as I mentioned, it's very important to look for the stimulus packages which are really focusing on the green transformation. And the pro is really that at least I would say, 35 to 38% or 35% of the Green Deal recovery package is going for a really green transformation, and that's much better than many countries of the world. However, it should be 100%, and that's a con, I would say, that still there's investment going into fossil fuel infrastructure like new pipelines, LNG terminals, which are really focusing or increasing a path dependency on old technology, and we should invest all the money we are now providing in the recovery package for renewable energy and the really green transformation. Sustainable mobility, as we have heard from other speakers as well, is important. And I would say that's both a pro and con, and really to focus on the green transformation would be desirable.
Great. Thank you for the answer, Professor Kempfert. Professor Haas, would you like to respond to that question? How can the COVID crisis and recovery plan accelerate the Green Deal?
Yeah, I think Claudia has already mentioned the most important issues. But what I think is, in addition, very important is to think about the current tax system. So we have different instruments to bring about a more green energy system. But I think to strive for a European-wide, mainly harmonized tax system with a significant CO2 price is, from my point of view, the most important aspect. And maybe in addition, we can try in transport to get the cars out of the cities and to bring about here more environmentally benign technologies, which also goes in lockstep with what Manfred has mentioned for Italy, that private transport is increasing. So if private transport is on a setback, then it should at least be in an environmentally benign way.
Great. Thank you for the answer, Professor Haas. Dr. Alessur, would you like to respond to that question as well?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the Green Deal can accelerate the green transition, and we really need to pursue the efforts that are made on this kind of European projects that are presented during this conference, because I think it's the only way to model really accurately the impact of renewables technology on the power system, for example, but more generally on the energy system. and to assess exactly of their true impact. Of course, they reduce the production of emission, but there is also counterparties to be able to respond to their variability. So we really need to be cautious when doing this kind of analysis, and I'm sure this will be handled by future research work, which need to be done very seriously, taking into account all the different counterparts, I would say.
Great, thank you for the response as well. And Professor Hofner, would you like to get the last word in about how the COVID crisis and recovery plan can accelerate the Green Deal?